But what they don't do is they don't differentiate out, so they're not effective. They don't become basophils, eosinophils, they're just kind of like empty shells taking up space. So the count goes way up, but the protection goes down. And that's leukopenia. That's a leukemia situation. Leukemia goes up, counts go down, that's leukopenia. Or mono, that's a condition we see, get just too many monocytes. And that's usually triggered by something. There's usually some kind of virus or something going on that happens in there, and then it lingers for a long time and hangs out. Then the last formed element are our platelets, little cell fragments. And their function is to clot. And the hormone that talks to them is thrombopoietin. And they'll differentiate out and become little fragments and clot up the vessels. And this was a situation where we talked about positive feedback, where the platelets rush to the site, the blood rushes to the site, the platelets go there, they dam it up. And then we also have to have clotting factor in there, and then they clog up the area. We form a scab, and then we stop the bleeding, and then eventually that's going to dissolve, and we go back. So as long as the clot goes away, that's the desired goal. But if a clot forms, that's called a thrombus. And if that thrombus breaks free and it travels somewhere, then that's called an embolism. And that becomes very dangerous because that clot is free to travel wherever it wants, and then it'll stop up when it gets to the next smallest vessel. So that might be in the heart, it might be in the lungs, it might be in the brain. That's an embolism. A pulmonary embolism if it lodges in the heart. Questions over any of that? And then we go into blood groups. We have 4 groups, A, B, AB, and O. What makes those groups are the antigens that live on the red blood cell surface. If there's an A antigen, you're type A. If there's a B antigen, you're type B. If they're both there, you're type AB. And if they're not there, you're type O. And the other factor in that is the RH factor. If it's present, you're positive. If it's not, you're negative. And type O is the universal donor, it can give to anybody. Type AB is the universal recipient, it can receive from anybody. And then we have your pictures over on page 653. So make sure you know that for the lab test. It won't be on the lecture test, but they'll show you pictures of clotting. Remember, if there's clumping or clotting, that's called agglutination. And if we see that, that's a positive sign. Wherever it clumps, that's the blood type you are. So if it clumps in A, you're type A. If it clumps in B, you're type B. If both, you're type AB. And if no clumping at all, you're type O. And then if the RH factor clumps, then you're positive. Questions over any of that? And the condition we see with the positive, negative, that's with mom and baby. And that's that erythro-red blastosis, blasting the cells, erythroblastosis fetalis of the fetus. So if mom's positive and baby's negative, or vice versa. The first time it's okay, mom's body forms antibodies against the baby's. The second time you have to get that rhodium shot to suppress that, and then the baby will take on the mom's blood type, and then it'll be born and everything's fine, and then eventually the baby develops its own blood type. So we recycle our red blood cells every 3 months, every 3 to 4 months. So in the beginning, the baby will have its opposite blood type. And then once mom's blood gets out of its system, we recycle and regenerate, make our own blood type, then the baby will be its own after that. Same thing happens if you have a transfusion. So if you ever want to commit a crime, that's the time to do it, right after your transfusion. So you're going to have somebody else's blood in you. This is always like CSI or those shows, and they're like, the blood didn't match. Turns out they had a transfusion, so with somebody else's blood. Then your body takes over and makes it. All right, that's it for chapter 17. So So as far as lab test material, be able to identify under the microscope all the different formed elements and tell what they do. And then the blood typing is be able to look at the pictures and see what clumping and know what it was before. That's the blood portion of the lab test. Then on to the heart. So know your anatomy of the heart, obviously. The heart is a two-sided pumping chamber. The right side we call the pulmonary circuit. The left side we call the systemic circuit. The right side is oxygen poor or deoxygenated, and the left side is oxygen rich. And then we go through the anatomy. So remember the heart sits a little more to the left. It's in the media sternum in the middle, but a little more to the left, 2/3 to the left. And then we have our anatomy, atrium up on top, our receiving chambers. Ventricles on the bottom are ejecting chambers. In between, we have the interventricular septum. And then we have valves, and the valves are there to make sure that the blood goes in one direction, that it controls the flow. There's doors that control the flow. If it's between the atrium and the ventricle, it's an AV valve. And the two AV valves on the right is a tricuspid, on the left is the bicuspid. So what they're doing is the AV valves are preventing backflow from the ventricle up into the atrium, because that's what it's blocking. So if we have blood in the ventricle, we're going to close the AV valve so it doesn't back up in there. And we need to close it so we can build pressure, and then the pressure pushes it out the next valve, which is the pulmonary semilunar valve. So the semilunar valves separate the ventricles to the outside of the body. If it's the pulmonary semilunar valve, it's separating the right ventricle to the lungs. And if it's the aortic semilunar valve, it's separating the left ventricle out to the aorta and the rest of the body. So we have AV valves and we have semilunar valves. AV valves separate atrium and ventricle. They prevent backflow up into the atrium. We want to have all that pressure down in the ventricle. And then we push the next door open. The semilunar valves prevent the backflow down into the ventricle. We want it to go out to the rest of the body, so it prevents that backflow. Okay, and that keeps the direction and the pressure going, and the valves help keep that pressure and direction going in the proper figure 8 format. The AV valves have chorda tendineae, little cords that attach into capillary muscles. The semilunar valves don't have that, they're just thin little cusps. Saw that in the back second. And then coronary circulation, we have the right and left coronary arteries. The right is going to wrap around the right side of the heart. The left is going to start at the base of the aorta, and then it's going to wrap around to the left and to the back. And that's what's going to supply the heart with all the blood and nutrients that it needs, or the coronary arteries. And then the coronary veins are going to drain them. Circumflex artery goes all the way around on the bottom. And then the veins match the arteries. Plus we have the coronary sinus on the back. And we have the great cardiac vein and the branches off of that. If we're having a heart attack, the official word for that is myocardial heart muscle infarction. Myocardial infarction is an MI, or a heart attack. And that's lack of oxygen to the heart muscle. And that's coming from the coronary arteries. We don't get enough oxygen through those coronary muscles. Okay. Any questions over anatomy? Then we look at heart muscle. We know that it is striated, but it's branching. It still has calcium coming to it. That's how we contract. So nothing over, really nothing over page 671. We've already done that in the muscle chapters. Over to 673. Just know that, we know what it looks like. We've already done that. And we know that whole calcium's got to come on board in order to do that. We have actin and myosin and that whole cross bridge thing from chapter 9. Nobody wants to go back and visit that. Been there, done that, right? Moving right along. So we get into the physiology. How do we contract the heart? It has its own intrinsic conducting system. It starts up on top with the SA node that sets the rhythm at 100 beats per minute. Then it goes down to the AV node. That transmits the message, the electrical signal down to the bundle of His, and then up the corners on the Purkinje fibers. And that's all you need to know about that. You don't have to go back through all that depolarization and contraction and all that, sodium, potassium, done that already. And what it looks like is the EKG on page 677. When the atrium are contracting properly, that's the P wave. When the ventricles are contracting properly, that's QRS. And the ventricles relax, that's the P wave. We looked at examples of things that go wrong on page 679. If everything's good, we see a normal sinus rhythm. If we get chaotic, that's a fibrillation, that's ventricular fibrillation, and that's when we shock the person. And then the sounds that we're hearing, we're actually hearing the love dove, love dove, love dove. The sounds that we're hearing are the valves opening and closing. The first heart sound is the AV, the atrioventricular valves, and we hear the love sound when those close. And the second sound, dove, is when the semilunar valves close. The first sound has to do with the tri and bicuspid. The second sound has to do with the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves. And when we listen to the heart, we want to hear that nice, crisp, clear love, dove. It's a very distinct sound. It's not love, shh, dove. Then we know we have a heart murmur, or maybe a valve prolapse. Something's going on with the valve. So we hear whooshing or pitching sounds. So listening for the love dove sound, and what we're hearing are the closings of the AV valve or semilunar valves. And then cardiac output, heart rate times stroke volume, we've gone over that. Things that it's a direct relationship. If heart rate goes up and if stroke volume goes up, cardiac output's going to go up. That's just the main idea behind it. If we exercise, we're going to have more demand, so we're going to have to pump it through quicker. So cardiac output will go up because the heart rate is going up, and we're pumping more blood through more quickly. So it's going to not increase volume, increase speed of pushing. And then terminology, speeding up heart, tachycardia, or slowing down, bradycardia. And that's it for chapter 18. Okay, so that'll be your first test. Lots of stuff. Questions? So, on to the next chapter, which is the Vessels. So we'll do that. Do you guys want to take your test on Monday or Wednesday? Wednesday. Okay. So we'll take your test on Wednesday. That'll give you a little bit of breathing room leading up to your lab test maybe. If you study for the same stuff. So it won't really hurt you this time to have a test, the two tests in the same week, because it's directly related. It's the exact same stuff. You know, right? Hopefully it'll help you. You're studying that. All right, so your lecture test will be on Wednesday. Same thing, 50 questions, multiple choice. And you'll have the first hour to take it, and then we'll come back and lecture the second hour. That's it. On to chapter 19, the Vessels. Here we go. Welcome to summer school. The fun just keeps coming. We just keep piling for more. And this is what we're doing in lab this week, is we're looking at the vessels. And they're really not that bad once you go through. If you just pay attention to the anatomy, the vessels are going to those organs, or they're located in that area. So at first, when you go through that lab, it's a little overwhelming, but when you sit down, spend a little time with it, it's really not that bad. So let's talk about arteries and veins and capillaries. We're in the vessel chapter, and arteries are always going to carry blood away from the heart, and veins are always going to carry it back towards the heart. Arteries have this smooth muscle in it. So remember, we're in vessels, so we're talking about smooth muscle now. And arteries are going to have a much thicker, smooth muscle wall, and that's going to allow muscle or arteries to vasoconstrict and vasodilate. So when we're talking about blood pressure, we're always going to be talking about an artery because they have that ability to expand and contract. Veins, on the other hand, they have a wee little bit of smooth muscle in there, but they're not vasoconstricting and dilating. They're just kind of like a reservoir for blood. Blood hangs out in the veins, but it's not pulsing through like it is through an artery. So we'll talk more about that. But veins kind of just collapse down on themselves. They don't have enough rigidity in that muscle wall, so they just kind of like hang out like a balloon, and they're a reservoir, but they just kind of hang there. So we don't have a lot of pressure in the veins. The pressure is out here in the arteries. So arteries are going to be rigid, and if we look at them under the microscope, we're going to see them nice and open. And if we look at a vein, it kind of looks like a boomerang. It's going to be collapsed on itself because it doesn't have much structure to hold it open. So there's a difference between looking at arteries and veins. The opening is called the lumen. No matter which vessel we're in, the opening is the lumen. We're always going to have smooth muscle in there. The artery has more, so it gives it more structure. The vein doesn't have much, so it's going to be more flexible. So we know we're moving oxygen-rich blood in the arteries, except for that one place on the back of the heart. And we're going to move oxygen through the arteries, and then it's going to get back to the heart, and we're going to pick up oxygen and deliver it to the rest of the body, and we're going to get oxygen poor. So how do we connect the arteries and the veins? Are they, like connected, or are they two separate systems? How do we get blood? Yeah, capillaries. Capillaries are the connectors between them. So we go in order of large arteries to small arteries, and then we get into the tiniest ones, which are capillaries. And capillaries are tiny, and then they feed into veins, and we go from small veins to large veins. So it's kind of this loop. The largest artery is our aorta. We saw that in lab. The arch of the aorta branches up and goes to the head and out to the arms. And then the thoracic aorta supplies the chest. The abdominal aorta supplies the abdominal organs. So the aorta is the largest vessel in our body, the largest artery in our body. And off of that, we're going to have lots of branches. So it goes artery to arterioles, small little arteries. And when we were looking like at the celiac trunk, we had all those different arteries coming off of it. They're going to be much smaller. So we go from a large one down to a smaller one. So it goes arteries to arterioles, which is just getting smaller and smaller in diameter. And then eventually we're going to cross over to capillaries, and that's where exchange occurs. And then we go from little tiny venules to much larger veins, like our superior and inferior vena cava. And we exchange in the heart, and then we just keep going. So it's a closed loop of blood, and the connector are the capillaries and the heart. That's how we keep moving oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. Arteries take oxygen-rich blood away from the heart, and then veins return the oxygen-poor blood back up to the heart. So remember, when we come into the heart, how do we come in? Superior and inferior vena cava. So veins are coming towards the heart. They're returning oxygen-poor blood, or from the head, we're coming down the jugulars and into the heart, or we're coming up the vena cavas from the lobe. So veins are always going to return oxygen-poor blood to the heart. We dump into the right atrium, the right ventricle, out the pulmonary arteries, into the lungs. Then we bring oxygen-rich blood back in, and that aorta is going to shoot it out to the rest of the body, oxygen-rich blood. It's going to deliver it to everybody through all those branches. And then we're going to have to get back up to the heart. So we exchange through the capillaries, and we take that oxygen-poor blood back up, and we go through it again. We're doing that all the time, all the time, all the time. So we're in that closed loop system, and the connectors are the capillaries and the heart. capillaries out in the extremities and the heart and the, yes.
In your utero, is the system completed, like the very first heartbeat, you would do the SA node, same thing as like a normal heartbeat?
In utero, there's bypassing and shunting, so the mom's body does some of the work for the baby.
Where those valves close off?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's called the fossa or foramen ovale, where it shunts directly from the atriums. It doesn't go all the way through the ventricles, it shunts through. And it goes atrium straight out the lungs and back in.
And in birth, is that when you first hear like crying and stuff, is
Right.
where that starts?
Yeah, and then it closes up, and then the baby's heart does its own thing. Right. So yeah, so good question. When the baby's in utero, it's not quite going through that whole system because it's not mature enough, it's not developed enough to do that yet. And so blood shunts just from the atriums. And then there's a hole in between the atrium. It's called the foramen or fossa ovale, the oval hole. And it shunts blood back and forth through that. And then that closes in most cases. And then we go through the figure 8 loop that we've been learning. So in utero, it's not like that. Once the baby is born, that closes, and then they go through their own cycle. All right, so we know arteries are carrying blood away, oxygen-rich blood away. They have lots more muscles to them, and they're going to have exchange going on. So when we're looking at our vessels, we want to look and see how continuous or how porous are these vessels. How are we getting exchange of stuff? We always talk about blood delivers oxygen and nutrients. Well, how does it do that? It's the degree of leakiness of those blood vessels. So we have 3 different levels of leakiness in our blood, of our arteries, and they're going to be continuous. Like our blood-brain barrier, it's going to be very tight. It's just going to be a continuous membrane. Like our skin is a continuous membrane, our blood-brain barrier. So things are not going to get across those vessels in that area. It's a continuous layer, and we're providing the nutrients we need, but we're not letting other things in and out of it. Or it's going to be slightly open, or we're going to have, well, it says riddle, so a lot more. We're going to have more openings in the vessels so things can get in and out. And we're talking about our kidneys and our small intestines. So we're going to have holes or pores in those blood vessels so we can get the nutrients out to the small intestines. Or we can filter things through the kidneys, or we can filter through things and grab a hold of things that we need. So they're going to be pretty porous. And the last one, they're just like almost open. They're very, very leaky. And this would be like the liver. The liver has to filter all that blood all the time and detoxify it. So it's going to be really open capillaries and vessels in there. So let's take a look at those pictures, and it'll make a little more sense. So we're still talking about the vessel, and if it's continuous, remember we have those tight junctions that are holding everything tightly together. So the red blood cells traveling through there, and we still have a little bit of pores so we can get water and nutrients through, but that's about all that's going to get through. Then we go down to this level, see how many holes we have. So our red blood cells still traveling through, but we have a lot more holes. So the GI tract can absorb the nutrients it needs. The kidneys can filter the stuff that it needs. The endocrine glands can secrete hormones that it needs to get out to the body. So still a blood vessel, but more holes so that we can do these functions that we need to do. And then the last one is very leaky. They're really large pores, so we're just kind of oozing out, and that's the liver, the spleen, the adrenal glands. So we're getting all that detoxing out if it's the liver, or blood cells if it's the spleen, hormones if it's the adrenal glands, or bone marrow if we're getting out all the things that the bone marrow does. So we have not just one kind of blood vessel. We have 3 different kinds, depending on where it is, what its function, the structure determines function. So depending on where you are, if you're in the brain, we don't want to look like this. Everything in the world can get across to the brain, and we can't have that. So this exists where it needs to, in the liver, in the spleen, out in the adrenal glands. And the brain is nice and tight, and the skin is nice and tight, so we can limit the passage of what we want to come in and out. So capillaries have different levels of structure. Yes. So
So like our peripheral veins, those would be the tighter veins?
Right, yeah, smaller, they get smaller and smaller.
Okay.
Yeah, everything to the periphery is always gonna be smaller.
Oh, you have like compression socks?
Yeah,
Okay,
yep, so they squeeze and push things up.
okay.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. All right, so we're in the blood vessels, and we have blood pressure. So the force exerted against the wall of a vessel by the blood contained in it. Blood is circulating around through the vessel. How much pressure is going to be in there? That's called blood pressure. We measure it in units of millimeters of mercury, and we measure it in the large artery near the heart. So we're going to measure it in our brachial artery, which remember we go aorta to subclavians, axillary brachial, if we're going out the left side. So we're going to be close to the heart. We're still in a pretty large artery. That's where we're measuring our blood pressure. We can do it in other areas, but that's typically where we do it. This is an easy location. If we need to, we can take it out in the periphery. If we're checking to make sure you're having blood flow to your feet, we check your dorsal pedicellus on the top of your foot. And this is when somebody's laying there and you just have your hand on the top of the foot and you're checking for a pulse. So they don't even know you're checking for it, but you're just checking the blood flow. So we can check it anywhere, but where we take the measurement is usually up here in the brachial artery, because that's the highest where we're going to find the pressure. Okay, so blood flow is the movement of blood through the vessel or an organ or the whole body, cardiac output, what we've been talking about. How much blood are we putting out to the whole, how much blood is the heart putting out to the whole body, cardiac output. So when we are talking about blood flow, obviously it's the flow of blood through whatever is contained in the vessel or in the organ or out to the whole body. It's blood flow. And blood flow and blood pressure are going to be related to each other, aren't they? If we don't have any pressure, how much flow are we going to have? Little flow. We have to have pressure pushing or we're not going to have any flow. So blood flow and blood pressure are related to each other. And how they're related is through resistance. And resistance we know is, so we're talking about blood vessels, so we're going to be talking about the diameter of the blood vessel. And resistance is anything that's going to obstruct that flow. It might be the diameter of the vessel, or maybe there's a blood clot in there, or maybe there's an accumulation of cholesterol in there. So anything that gets in the way of flow is called resistance. So what are some things that would increase resistance in our vessels? Is long term, the greater your blood vessel length is, the more resistance. So the farther we get away from the heart, the vessels are longer, they're going to be more narrow, so there's going to be more resistance out to the periphery. And that makes sense. The further away we are, the narrower we're getting, so there's more resistance. The greater the fat, so that's why we always say it's dangerous to have fat around the belly, because we're compressing that big, large abdominal area in there. Viscosity, certainly, the thicker the blood is, that's going to create some kind of resistance, isn't it? If it's normal thickness versus it gets sticky, then it's not going to flow very well. And then hematocrit, when we talk about blood doping, we increase the level of red blood cells, so it gets a lot stickier, so there's a lot more resistance there. So long term is just basically what is our anatomy, is the long term effects of it. Short term is what is going on with the diameter. What is the nervous system doing? Is it vasodilating or is it vasoconstricting? So we remember we were talking about the autonomic nervous system is always in charge of blood vessels, vasoconstricting and dilating. So that's our short term. Normally we're just sitting here with normal anatomy. We have good flow. We have good pressure, so we have good flow. There's little resistance, so we're all doing good. If all of a sudden the fire alarm goes off, we all jump up and we go running out. So our sympathetics kick up, our blood vessels constrict, and our blood flow shoots up. There's a lot more resistance, so there's going to be a lot more pressure. So we feel that pounding feeling in our head or where we can feel. So short term, we're referring to what is going on with homeostasis, so we're vasoconstricting or vasodilating. And long term is we're just talking about what is our anatomy. We have the further away we are, the longer the length, the shorter the vessel, the greater the resistance. So here's our diameters. If we go and we open your kitchen sink just a little bit, how much flow do we have? If we open it just a little bit, how much flow do we have? a little bit of flow. So the diameter is directly related, is related to, inversely related to the flow. If we have a little opening in there, we got a lot of resistance, so we're gonna have a little bit of flow in there, right? The greater the resistance, it's gonna affect the flow. If we don't have much resistance, we have, you know, wide open vessel, we're gonna have a lot of flow, right? So, and there's an inverse relationship between resistance and diameter. If we have a tiny little vessel, we're gonna have all kinds of force going through there, so that's an inverse relationship. And if we get the vessel bigger, then we don't have much pressure in there, so there's gonna be a lot of flow going on. So it's an inverse relationship. So this is why we have to keep homeostasis. If our blood vessels are wide open, there's not any resistance, but there's no pressure, so the flow is gonna go down, so we're gonna pass out. And that's when we get into an anaphylactic shock kind of situation, or a shock situation, as the blood vessels dilate, there's no pressure, there's no flow, and you're gonna pass out. Or we get into the opposite, where type A, we have high blood pressure, vessels are constricted, the pressure is high, and then we get into a dangerous situation with that scenario. So we need to have good homeostasis of normal vessels, not too small, not too big, and then flow is going to be good, and pressure is going to be good. So laws of physics is what we're talking about. So the smaller the diameter, the greater the resistance. That's the inverse relationship. The diameter and resistance. Okay, vasoconstriction and dilation. And if we have vasoconstriction, so we're talking about the smaller the diameter, we go into a